Welcome back. I'm Dr. Dwight Turner. This is Being the Other, and this week we're going to look at the experience of the invisible other. Let's get started. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Dwight Turner. This is Being the Other, and this week we're going to talk about the experience of the invisible other. Now, I recently read a news article on the BBC website, and I'll put the link to it down below. And the newspaper said actually something along the lines of 25% of us don't even acknowledge the disabled when we actually come across them. We tend to ignore them or marginalize them in some way. And that experiences like this for the disabled lead to increased levels of isolation, psychological distress, and so on. And I was sort of intrigued by that, this idea that we actually sometimes cause the other harm by ignoring them. And what does it actually mean? But what struck me was the varying ways that we actually make the other invisible. You know, in the States, issues of voting rights, the discussion about who has the right to vote and why, are huge topics of discussion and have been for a good 2 or 3 or generations, maybe hundreds of years, I would argue. In the movie Selma, it's something which is discussed on a regular basis in that movie there. Does someone of colour have the right to vote? That's just one example. Another one comes out of those people who have mental illness and who are marginalised in institutions away from major metropolises. And that's nothing new. The whole idea, for example, here in the UK, of in the years gone by, you'd go off to go and see the, I hate this word, but the crazy people in the institution, you pay your penny. That's a way of keeping the other contained, separate from the majority. We've just looked at how we can just, even through microaggressions of our own, marginalise and ignore the other. You know, for example, if you see someone who's disabled on the train, how keen are you to sit next to them? Or how much of a difficult thing is to bring within oneself that therefore means you're going to ignore them in some way. It's important here to recognise and to really underline the huge psychological problems we cause the other when we make them invisible. I already mentioned there in a news article on the BBC about increased levels of loneliness. But that's just one of the symptoms, one of the outcomes, in fact, of being marginalized and made invisible. You know, there are studies out of the Caribbean where racism and the invisibility of the other is actually attributed to or linked to increased levels of obesity and diabetes. These sorts of things rumble onwards. People assume that there is no real psychological impact to be made invisible, but actually there are many different layers. It often becomes quite internalized. And that can go so far as to the other making themselves invisible, an internalized, unconscious part of themselves which grows and just fuels itself over time. But some of the reasons why we would actually marginalize and make the other invisible is because of a fear of actually equity, equality, all these aspects. For us to really acknowledge that we really are serious about having an equal playing field, the other has to be seen and acknowledged. But that brings up a second problem. In order for us to acknowledge that the other is equal to us in some way, we then have to give them back their humanity. There's a challenge for many majorities within that who've marginalised and denigrated those of difference, be they women or disabled or whoever else. These are key points. In order to acknowledge the humanity of somebody else, then we come back to a change in who we are, who we believe we happen to be as human beings. Whatever structure we place around ourselves is challenged by the new human being, new inverted commas, that sits opposite us in their difference. So whilst this is a slightly more brief discussion about the experiences of the other, it's a hugely important one. There are many ways to place somebody through a process of othering, one of which is just to not see them, to ignore them, to pretend that they don't exist. in my very first podcast, my welcome one, when I talked about the lady who crossed the road, there was an attempt there, I could argue, to not see me, to deny my very existence. That is the invisibility of the other at play through a process of othering. I'm going to leave that cast there. And again, thanks for your messages. Keep sending me whatever you can. I will try to reply to all of you as best as I can do. Hard to keep up sometimes. I will talk to you soon. Take good care.